The men of 1 and 2 sections of Q Detachment Special Air Service were yet to carry out the sort of operation upon which they now found themselves. To date, they had been involved only in the work of intelligence gathering and assisting in bringing local resistance groups under the command and control of the Allied High Command. Now suddenly they had a raiding task, orders to hit an enemy facility that had once been a humble farm compound but had been converted by the enemy to act as a transit prison of sorts. Prisoners of war were being temporarily held there before transportation away, but perhaps more importantly, it was a place where people from the local population were often taken for questioning and, on occasion, torture. And given the high levels of resistance activity, as well as special forces operations in the area, this threatened a lot of Allied covert intelligence work in this region of the war. Corporal Ewan Smith of 2 Section remembers how he and his men had actually failed at their initial task. We had arrived at night and would have about a day to carry out a CTR, that's a close target reconnaissance, but enemy patrols, including patrols with armoured cars, just would not leave us alone. We had remained covert up until this point, until at last, after 1 section arrived with the Bofors gun, things actually got hot and we had to engage an armoured car coming up the road. This of course blew any kind of surprise or covert operations out the window, and we hadn't been able to even approach the target area for a good look to see what they had there waiting for us. It didn't take Sergeant Clive Martin of 1 Section long to realise that things weren't quite going to plan when his section arrived at the rendezvous point with 2 Section. Well, my lads arrived expecting a briefing from Sergeant Winnie Watts of 2 Section, and actually as it goes, we arrived at the same time as the naval party. You see, part of our operation involved the Royal Marines and the Naval Commandos. They were meant to be a follow-on force to basically cover our rear as we retreated from the target zone after our raid had ended. They also had some engineers that would blow up the place and destroy anything the enemy might be able to use. But they had arrived about 12 hours early. Apparently there'd been some sort of storm out at sea, so they'd been given the choice: land early or abandon their part of the plan and bugger off and leave us. They decided to arrive early, which was the better choice. But immediately now, we were in a bit of an awkward situation. Commanding the Naval and Commando part of the force was a Lieutenant Bernard Price. And that's a Navy Lieutenant, not an Army Lieutenant, which basically meant he had the equivalent rank of an Army Captain, making him the ranking officer. Lieutenant Bernard Price, though undoubtedly meaning well, immediately began throwing the weight of his senior rank around, basically imposing himself as the commanding officer of the entire operation. As already explained by Sergeant Martin, the Naval Commandos and the Royal Marine Commandos had arrived with their equipment, support weapons and the like, were meant as a support element of the operation. And even as these support elements continued to arrive, the SAS men, who were covering the road towards their target zone, kept on coming under probing attacks from the enemy garrison. And if the earlier sound of the Bofors gun engaging the armoured car had not awoken the garrison in the area, the 3-inch mortar exploding amongst a small enemy patrol coming through the forest area certainly would have done. A quick meeting of minds now occurred between the 2 SAS lieutenants, Terry Mason and Glyn Brown, together with the Naval Lieutenant Bernard Price, to decide the best course of action. They were still prepared to launch their raid, however, they were doing so without having carried out a reconnaissance of the target area first. Lieutenant Glyn Brown of 2 Section SAS explained to his counterparts how the enemy garrison was wide awake and had been quite alert. He believed that the troops there were of a higher calibre. They were carrying out aggressive patrols in the area, which in his opinion proved that the military intelligence people that had tasked the SAS with this operation had for once gotten good information and had gotten things quite right. The high levels of enemy activity in the area proved that this target was worth going for. They came up with a very quick ad hoc plan, and immediately their force began to shake out and prepare for the operation. The 2 SAS sections would lead the assault, as per the original plan. The commandos and the engineers would follow up, providing whatever support was needed to overwhelm the enemy in the area. What was known of the target area was that on the other side of a narrow river was a forested area, a very small forested area, beyond which was a wide open field that the men would have to cross in order to attack their target. Getting across this open ground would be a high-risk move, but it had to be done. In order to assist in this move across open ground, it was decided that the nearby vehicles that had been knocked out by the Bofors gun would be utilised to support the men as they crossed the open ground. The Royal Engineers, though not mechanics by trade, did have some very technically skilled men who were quite capable of repairing any engine damage that may have been caused to the vehicles by the Bofors gun, and they could do a quick body repair job in order to get the vehicles working enough that they might be used in the operation. Meanwhile, the rest of the force began to move towards the river, crossed the small stream and into the woods, thus keeping any further enemy patrols at bay so they couldn't attack the forming up area of the rest of the force. The engineers got to work on the armoured car, and a machine gun was placed to cover the bridge, which itself suffered a direct hit from the commandos' own mortar, showering their machine gun counterparts in shards of wood, leading to a very choice set of words to be exchanged between the two crews later in the day. Fortunately, the river was shallow enough that the knocked out bridge would not cause a delay to the attacking force, and a section of roaring commandos were ordered to cross the bridge and take up position on the left flank in order to guard against any vehicles approaching from that direction. One of the enemy vehicles knocked out right on the bridge itself was in fact a Panzer I tank. Little more than an armoured scout car really, but it would be ideal for assisting the force in their attack. The SAS men rubbed their hands together with glee at the idea of using the enemy's own vehicles against them. They like to burrow enemy equipment, as they put it. They had, on their patrol towards the target area, already burrowed a German 20mm gun, an anti-aircraft weapon that could be very useful in the ground support role, and they were utilising it now to engage enemy patrols pushing towards the tree line. But here is where the attack began to break down and lose momentum, almost immediately after starting. The two SAS sections were all for charging across the open ground towards the target, getting in amongst the buildings, and using their speed and aggression to get stuck into the enemy before they could organise themselves. But again, the well-meaning Lieutenant Bryce had insisted that they hold up, wait for the vehicles to be put back into working action and crewed by some of his men before the main assault begun. He was also moving his support weapons around to ensure they had maximum amount of firepower to bring down upon the farm buildings for the attack. The armoured car was quickly got back into service and crewed by a pair of men, and technically speaking, Lieutenant Price was correct, but this was not the SAS way. They were used to moving fast and not stopping until the job was done, using their speed, aggression and initiative to overwhelm the enemy positions. But at the moment, they sat, quite indignant, amongst the trees, waiting for the order to go, whilst the commandos and Royal Marines prepared for the attack. They didn't hesitate, however, to exchange shots with the enemy garrison shooting from the farm buildings, and the two SAS lieutenants had to do everything within their power to ensure their men were kept on the leash, or else they would be charging off across no man's land. The garrison, perhaps not realising what they were up against, now began their own counterattack, and this, of course, angered the SAS men. The enemy were getting organised enough to launch their own attacks against their positions. The burrowed armoured car now pushed out to the left flank, and this was enough for the SAS men to decide now was the time. Lieutenant Glyn Brown of 2 Section SAS decided he'd had enough of waiting. "Follow me, chaps, let's go," he cried as he got up and moved towards the enemy. But it was just at this moment that the clanking of caterpillar tracks could be heard. An enemy tank was somewhere amongst the farm buildings. "Get that fucking Bofors up here!" Sergeant Winnie Watts of 2 Section called, and indeed, the Bofors gun, mounted on its own tractor, began to be driven forwards, ready to engage the armoured cars. This was the most effective anti-armour weapon the British forces had in the area, and had been landed specifically for its mobility and high rate of fire. It immediately began to engage a second tank that had arrived from the south, moving into the farm area, firing several shots with armor-piercing rounds, but not scoring any noticeable hits. A stream of tracer fired by the 20mm cannon borrowed from the Germans showed the British forces where their enemy tank was. The Bofors re-engaged and began firing shots into the enemy tank. Round after round struck the enemy tank before whatever crew survived began to abandon their vehicle. This tank was a Panzer 35T, a Czech design that the Germans had added to their own stockpiles following the occupation of Czechoslovakia. By this point, 2 Section SAS had already pushed up to one of the outlying buildings, using it for cover, and one section now followed suit, moving up parallel under the cover of the 20mm cannon, blasting into the buildings over the heads of the SAS men as they charge across the open fields. At last, the repair work, the bodge repairs to the Panzer I, were now complete. The tank had been crewed, and the tank put into action. Once again, the sound of armoured movement coming from the farm buildings was heard as the enemy tank in amongst the buildings began to move around and prepare to counterattack against the British forces as they pushed up over the fields. Commandos, supported by the armoured car, pushed out to the left flank towards the south, the direction from which a great many enemy reinforcements were approaching the target area. A second section of commandos on the right flank got up and charged forward, bypassing two section SAS as they moved towards the buildings. It was here, now, that all hell seemed to break loose. Defenders of the farmyard facility now all began to open fire on the British forces moving across the field towards them. They had been holding back until this point, and now the enemy tanks began to push forwards as well, out of their garages, and their machine guns and cannons blazing away. "Tank! Fucking tank! Where's the Bofors? Get the Bofors going!" The shouts and warnings of the SAS men and commandos reached the Bofors crew, at this moment in time engaging enemy infantry out in the open. But now the driver began to reposition the vehicle, guided by his detachment commander, and the gun's crew once more readied themselves to engage enemy tanks. The gun quickly laid on, a single shot was fired. The 40mm armor-piercing round punched through the side plate of the Panzer 35T's armour, and almost immediately set the ammunition ablaze. It led to cause a catastrophic explosion, blowing the turret clean off the vehicle, and showering anyone in the nearby area in metal. This very brave move by the men manning the Bofors now left them somewhat exposed. Enemy infantry were now surging towards their vehicle. Fortunately, the SS men had recognised this, and one section SAS charged forwards towards the Bofors to give the men manning this vital weapon the support they needed to beat off the enemy's attempt at a counterattack. The whole British force now surged forwards, moving in towards the farmyard areas, whilst off on the left flank, the section of commandos guarding the river crossing there came under attack from a probing patrol, no doubt attracted by the sound of gunfire. And over on the right flank, two section SAS and the commandos, two of which had been killed during the enemy tank counterattack, held on against a dogged armoured car assault against their positions. It was around about this time that their own armoured car now went off in its own little escapade straight into the enemy encampment, spraying its machine guns as the enemy soldiers attempted to run for their lives. Meanwhile, the British 3-inch mortar continued a constant barrage of bombs flung into the enemy positions, making life for the garrison extremely difficult. The rest of the SAS men and the commandos now began to push up, assaulting their objectives. Prisoners they could not take, and so none were taken. And indeed, the facility turned out to be an intelligence goldmine. The engineers and reserve commando force was pulled forward to begin taking up defensive positions around the facility, as well as prepared demolition charges to destroy the buildings. The operation had been a complete success, despite its somewhat unsteady, slow start. It had cost the British force the lives of 2 commandos, as well as 4 men wounded. But for the enemy, the garrison of the facility, as well as men from the local town who had moved towards the facility upon hearing the sounds of gunfire and fighting, they had lost 151 men confirmed by the British forces. That is to say, their bodies were found, lined up and counted, searched for intelligence, etc, etc. And their losses also included 3 tanks, 2 Panzer 35Ts and 1 Panzer I, which the British now employed. Furthermore, 2 armoured cars had been captured and put into service after their crews had been knocked out. Light skirmishing with the survivors of the now scattered garrison would continue throughout the day, but the British, the SAS men and commandos, would not hang around very long. They had finished their destructive operation before pulling back towards their small beachhead.